Hi, everyone. My name's Steve Dubik. I'm the coordinator for the Master Gardening Program in Montgomery County with the University of Maryland Extension. And welcome to In the Garden. Today with me are two garden experts, Lisa Fair and Mary Barnhart. Let me tell you a little bit about the University of Maryland Master Gardener Program here in Montgomery County. We provide services throughout the clients in Montgomery County in a wide variety of areas. We have a speakers group, which Lisa's going to tell us a little bit more about here in a few minutes. We have several demo gardens. We have one at the Montgomery County Fairgrounds. We have one at the Durwood Extension Office. We also have one down at the Audubon facility down county. We have a therapeutic horticultural program. We have a youth gardening program, one-time events, Ask a Master Gardener program. I want to point out during the program, if you have any questions, you can post those on our comments section, and we'll try to answer those questions today. But if we don't get to the questions, we will try to bring those questions to our next session. And during the meantime, we'll try to answer those questions to you directly through email or through mail. So today, I was going to talk a little bit about some hot topics that I've noticed, and really just had one that really stands out to me, and that's, and I think most of you here in the garden, that's the weeds. The amount of rainfall that we've got in growing conditions this year have been exceptional. And one of the things we've noticed, unfortunately, that we had to close some of our demo gardens down. And the soils that we have in our demo gardens have been highly amended, enriched, and they're really good. And our Master Gardener volunteers are working really hard. One of the consequences for that is that during COVID, we had to close the gardens down, started reopening them up on a limited basis. And we've come back to our disappointment to see how much the weeds have taken over the garden. And you probably have something similar like that, maybe in your garden. So the weeds really do appreciate the amended soils and all the work that we've done. And so some of them are, phenomenal plants of size. So it's a lot of work taking care of that, trying to catch up with that. We're going to be working on that for the next few weeks, probably the rest of this season, and probably into next season too. So at this point, I was going to let Lisa Fair talk to us about what kind of questions we've gotten recently.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone. So the Speakers Bureau, just to give you a little information about that group, and that group does answer a lot of questions from our residents, but the Speakers Group is made up of Master Gardener volunteers who create presentations on a variety of topics, and they provide these presentations to any group within Montgomery County that requests a presentation. Garden clubs, homeowners associations, senior living communities, things of that nature, but really any group. And best of all, it's free. In addition, our speakers often present at the educational events that are hosted by Montgomery County Master Gardeners, such as the Spring Conference and Grow and Eat It. Prior to the pandemic, our presentations were given in person, but just like everyone else, we've had to adjust. And so now our speakers are giving their presentations via Zoom. So for any group that's interested in a presentation by a Master Gardener, just visit our webpage. There you'll find our brochure, which provides details of the topics on which our speakers present. You can also meet our speakers by clicking on the speaker's bio link, and we have an interactive form for you to fill out to request a speaker. Once we receive your request, myself or Erica Smith will get back in touch with you and help coordinate a speaker for your group. And Steve, I've looked through the questions today, and our speakers have presentations that cover every one of these topics.
That's great.
If you're interested, please do get in touch. We'll be happy to help. All right. I think we're ready for our first question, yes?
Yep.
All right. The first question comes from Linda in Darnestown, and she wants to set up a native plant space. It says, I'm interested in starting a native garden on the side of my driveway. The space I've sectioned off will get good afternoon sun, but it's currently covered in weeds. Do I need to dig up the weeds, or can I just smother them with cardboard, newspaper, and mulch? I'm hoping to plant in the spring. Thanks for your help.
Well, that's a really good question, very timely question that kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier. So it kind of depends upon the weeds that you have. If you have mostly annual weeds and a lot of things like crabgrass and goosegrass and weeds like that, I think putting newspaper or cardboard and a generous amount of wood chips or mulch over the top of that probably will do a really good job, as those weeds are going to be dying out soon. And some of the perennial weeds, even that will, I think, may do a very good job. But we do have some stubborn perennial weeds, like Bermuda grass, sometimes people call it wiregrass, that might poke through there. And you may have some weeds, some maybe little woody weeds that might go through that. So you can play it a couple different ways. One is to do that, put your newspaper, your cardboard, and your wood chips down, and then those weeds that do come through, hand remove those. You could try to mow it down, or take a weed eater or whacker, cut it down real low, remove all that debris, and compost it, and then put your material down. I think that may help to smother a little bit. And if you go through that process, it might cut back the perennial weeds to a point that might weaken them in a weakened condition. And at the end of the day, give you better results. You could apply. I know when she mentioned that in the native garden, so most people have a native garden, native plant garden, and I think it's a great idea to have a native plant garden that way. It really helps out in a wide variety of ways to our ecosystem and pollinators. If you can, probably going to be very concerned about using synthetic pesticides, but we do have a few organic type pesticides that could help. They're going to give they'll kill the weed on the top. It's not moved down into the bottom. So these stubborn weeds, we might have to come back and address them again in the spring. So that would include things like there's some citrus oil type products, there's some soap products, horticultural vinegar, and those, if the weeds are actually growing, would do a pretty good job, really good job on annuals and maybe young perennials. But I think she's going to have to come back and address some of the tougher weeds. But I think that's be a good start. And now's a great time to do it. So you're set in the spring. So taking advantage of the cooler weather that's hopefully coming down the line here. And good luck to her.
All right. Well, our next question is from Melissa in Potomac, and she has some issues with one of her shrubs. She says, one of my variegated weigela plants looks like it's burning up, but the others are not. What's wrong?
So I think, Mary, this is something you've seen before, the little spider webs on some of the...
I'm sorry, Steve. I think we're on the weigela shrub question from Potomac. Sorry about that.
Sorry. Okay. So the weigela shrub, that type of injury I see on weigela is pretty common on plants that are variegated, and that's a nice newer cultivar of variegated plants. And they're a little more problematic, these variegated plants, and these are ones that have like two or three different colors in the leaves. They're not as generally as tough, and so they may have some issues if the temperatures are too hot, too high. They may be a little more susceptible to getting scorch if there's little periods of hot and dryness going on. And so you can see another weigela you have, and maybe in cultivar wine and roses and some of these variegated ones. So I think it's just scorch. I think it's some of the weather we've had, and it will outgrow that. Unfortunately, once it gets that scorch on the edge of the leaf, it's permanent, of course, for the rest on that leaf for the rest of the year. So siting it properly, managing it through periods of dryness, and make sure maybe it doesn't get totally, baked in the sun. Maybe combinations of things will hopefully minimize that type of scorching that you see. But I believe it's really more of an abiotic problem, meaning that it's not really caused by a pathogen like a bacteria or fungus. It's more really sort of a genetic issue with that plant, having those different pigments in the leaves, causing it to be a little bit more susceptible to environmental stresses.
Sorry about that. I did skip our question from Kathy in Kensington. This is for Mary Ellen. She is concerned about an infestation. She says, attached are some pictures of our bushes with webbing, which we hope will give enough detail to help identify what the pest or pests might be. We've been applying neem oil and recently capped gaps, but the mites keep keep coming back or they just never leave. Recently, they've attacked our dwarf Japanese maple and our azaleas as well. Many thanks for your help in identifying this pest and also helping us figure out how to treat it.
Kathy, it's a very common problem in the gardens this year. There are two groups that generally of arthropods that cause webbing. One could be spider mites, and the other could be spiders. That's a webbing of the type you're talking about. And we are showing one picture, one of the pictures that you sent, because it's showing more clear webbing of that we figured you could see online. And the webbing in this case not caused by spider mites, it's caused by spiders, and they typically weave webs in quiet places away from disruption to trap their prey, such as the edges of lawns and at the base of low undisturbed bushes. The spiders are usually less than an inch long, and they you often don't see them because they're hiding. But you'll spot their webs, but especially in the morning when the dew is on. When it's a moist morning, you can see the dew on the webs. However, the spiders are never far from their webs because they're looking for insects, which is their source of food. These spiders are not a cause for alarm because they do not. The web-spitting spiders in general do not bite and threaten, and they are not harmful to humans. And rather than looking at animals, they're looking at insects and small insects and small other arthropods, which is their main food source. These spiders are beneficial because they eat many of the insects such as aphids and mites that could be feeding on your or mosquitoes that could be feeding on either you or your plants. The spider webs you can control if you don't like them. If you take a garden hose and spray a strong stream of water on the webbing, you'll knock the webbing down and potentially knock the spider down, so they'll have to either rebuild the web or go to another location. Hopefully they'll go to another location. But if you do not like the webbing in your lawn or in your bushes, there's a couple things you can do. One is mow the lawn regularly, because this disrupts the webs of the spiders that weave in grass. And you also can clean up debris such as wood piles and bricks, and plants. Any shrubs you have a space between them and between your house, so there's less of a confined area where the spiders might be like to build a web.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. So our next question comes from Dara in Darnestown, and she's having an issue with stilt grass. She says, stilt grass went to seed in some areas of my yard before I could knock it down, and I'm scared next year I won't be able to find anything but stilt grass. Are there any pre-emergents that are still allowed with the current Montgomery County pesticide ban? Any other recommendations to control stilt grass for next year now that it's seeded? And I think, Steve, that question is for you.
Thank you, Lisa. So, yes, stilt grass is a real tough, tenacious weed. It came into our area I noticed it about maybe 25 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. It's not a native weed. It's native from Southeast Asia. It's an annual grass, but it's very prolific in the amount of seeds that it produces. It has really good tolerance to shade and dampness, and so that's where you actually see it growing most prolifically. But it can grow in the full sun. If there's enough moisture, it can grow. It can in full sun, so it can invade a lawn. So we got really two ways of when we look at this. If it's in a bed, in a landscape bed, we have certain options we can do. If it's on a lawn, there's certain options we can do. And as Lisa pointed out, she mentioned there's a law in Montgomery County that restricts the type of pesticides that you're allowed to use onto a lawn. So you're limited there. So going to that, starting with the lawn option first, the lawn controlling stiltgrass in your lawn, it is easy to hand pull up, but sometimes, as most of you seen, it's all over the place, and it's just embedded through your lawn. May not be a really practical way of doing it. You can spot treat it with a non-selective herbicide that is approved on an approved list of herbicides that by the Montgomery County Department of Environment. And this reminds me, our producer Bev Carriger has been real helpful. From times as we're talking, she's posting links to some of the websites that I think would be beneficial for someone to, if they wanted to follow up through. So two of the links we'll have here is one is going to be addressing how to control weeds in a landscape bed. And there's some chemical options there, but some of those chemical options there cannot be used in a lawn. So that's what I'm trying to point out. So you're limited. So you can use some non-selective type herbicides like going to horticultural vinegar, or some citrus oil, clove oil type products. But the issue with that is that it kills everything. So if you have patches of stiltgrass, it might work for that. But then at this time of the year, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to put some turfgrass seed, maybe a little bit of top dressing. It's a good time of the year right now to just renovate the lawn and get rid of some of these patches, because what's going to happen, that stiltgrass is going to die. It's going to leave a void. Then next year, or even now, some of the winter annuals will try to invade there. And so hopefully creating a full dense lawn will mitigate it or slow it down. Now, it's pre-emergence. There's been one pre-emergent that's been talked about quite a bit in the past, and that's corn gluten. And it has some effectiveness to it, but I need to point out corn gluten is a high percentage of nitrogen. And to apply it at the rate that you need to apply it to get you good results for suppressing stiltgrass, you've added a really large amount of nitrogen. So what the nitrogen does, a couple of things. It's going to help stimulate your grass that's existing and to shade the area and create it denser. That's great. But if you get too much nitrogen, that can be problematic. Some of that nitrogen is not going to be taken up by the roots of the plants, the turfgrass plant, and it may run off. So it's actually probably at a level of nitrogen which you're not allowed to apply. There's a fertilizer law from the Maryland Department of Agriculture that limits the amount of nitrogen you apply in an area. So in order to get sort of like you solve one problem, you're creating another problem. So I'm not really big on corn gluten, unfortunately, because of the large amount of nitrogen you're putting down at one time. So you're in a tough spot with stiltgrass in a lawn, and we're all struggling with that. Maybe in the future there may be some other options, but right now you're kind of limited. But in a landscape bed, there are options. There are pre-emergents, and some of those pre-emergents are very similar to pre-emergents that we've used in the past in your lawn to control crabgrass and goosegrass. From those pre-emergents that control crabgrass and goosegrass, check the label, but they probably will do satisfactory, will probably some results. Stiltgrass, they're both in the grass family. One of the things that was pointed out, I think, in the original question was that stiltgrass produces a lot of seed. So even if you're very effective at pulling up the stiltgrass, there's still a large amount of seed probably from the preceding years, and maybe stiltgrass seed coming in from other areas. So you have the seed bed or seed bank that's there for several years. So you have to really remove it for several growing seasons to really see a depletion amount of stiltgrass coming up. It's a real struggle trying to manage stiltgrass, whether in a lawn or a vegetable garden or on your landscape bed. So as I said before, good luck. And it's probably going to be a lot of hand pulling, but the good thing is it's relatively easy to pull it by hand. So that's good.
Dara also asked some questions about her strawberries. She says when strawberries have been in a 4x8 raised bed for a few years and aren't producing well. I'd like to move them to a different location. Is it better to do that now in the early fall or wait till early spring? And so, Dara, you mentioned that you've had these plants for a few years, and it could be that it's just time for some new plants. Under ideal conditions, strawberry plants can live 5 to 6 years, usually peaking in the second and third years. However, after 3 productive years, the plants typically begin to lose vigor and production declines. So our recommendation would be to start a new berry patch in a new location with fresh plants. Planting fresh plants also prevents the potential of transplanting any insects or diseases that may try to ride along with your transplanted older plants. Of course, unless you select an ever-bearing variety, this means you won't have any crop from these plants in 2021. But you may be able to encourage some production from your older plants by renovating. You want to prune the plants to a height of 2 to 3 inches, remove any flower buds, damaged or discolored leaves and runners, and thin the daughters to about 6 inches apart. In the late fall, cover the plants with a 4-inch layer of straw for overwintering. For the new plants, plant in the spring in a prepared bed. Remember to pinch off any buds to help the plant focus on getting established. And if you've selected an ever-bearing variety, you can let that flower in the fall and harvest in the first year. You want to look for varieties that do well in our area and are disease resistant. Some varieties to consider would be Flavorful, which is a June-bearing variety known for its great flavor, or an ever-bearing variety would be Eversweet, also popular for its intense flavor. However, if you do decide you want to transplant your strawberries, they can be transplanted in the spring or fall, but a fall transplant may maximize your harvest for the next season. If you do transplant in the spring, do so once the soil is dry and thawed enough to be worked. You want these plants to be well established before the heat of the summer comes on. Right. And now Dara also is having an issue with her raspberry patch. So my raspberry plants ground out in June and never came back. I was irrigating, so water wasn't an issue. I had 3 new plants that I purchased from a reputable source, I think, but they may be the culprit. And I wonder if they brought the disease with them. All the leaves dried up and died, and the canes followed. They didn't send up much new growth the rest of the summer. Should I remove and replant new raspberries? Do I need to wait a certain amount of time before replanting? Should I wait, pre-treat with a fungicide, and see what they do next spring? So unfortunately, Dara, it's a bit difficult to diagnose based on this information alone. And without a diagnosis, we'd be reluctant to recommend any type of treatment. So what we recommend is to remove and destroy any diseased plants, start a new berry patch in a new location with fresh plants. Be sure to choose a location where there are no other brambles nearby, within 500 feet, as they can harbor disease and that can infect your raspberries. And when you're selecting new plants, again, you want to look for varieties that are disease resistant and appropriate for our area. Caroline or Jacqueline, which are both primocane varieties, or Nova, which is a floricane variety, do well here. And immediately upon planting your plants, you want to place a trellis system. A good trellis system can increase your production. All right, so our next question is from Melissa in Potomac, and this is for you, Steve. She asks, I've had a New Jersey tea plant when I moved into my home. Over the years, it withered. I'd like to get a new one, but I'm not sure it really likes the weather or soil here. Can you advise me? It's one of my favorites.
Okay, sure. That's a really nice plant. It is actually a native plant in Montgomery County. It's not super common around, but it's restricted to certain areas within Montgomery County, specific type of soils. They're called serpentine soils. So serpentine soils are kind of unique. They're relatively high in heavy metals, probably to the point you might be a little concerned to, say, have a vegetable garden there. So I kind of go back and I put 2 plants into 2 groups. They have ones that thrivers that just they're like bullies. They're aggressive, they're invasive, they're just growing all over the place. And then there's survivors. And I would put New Jersey tea in the latter. It's more of a survivor. So it grows in areas where other plants don't like to grow. One of the things it really needs is it needs to have well-drained soils. It's usually sandy or gravelly where you find it. Soils that actually have low fertility. So it's hanging around there. And you see highway departments and sometimes in Virginia using it on the hillsides and places like that. So if the drainage is poor or if it got really wet, I'm a little worried about that now. So we might have periods of time where everything's fine. And then, like in the last few days where we get a lot of rain, if the plant roots sit in there for too long, they may get weakened and predisposed. And then it's sort of slow, like maybe a slow demise after that. The plant never really recovers. It hangs on, but it just slowly, kind of withers away or fades away over time. But I applaud anyone from growing plants like New Jersey tea because there's several of our native butterflies use this as a nectar source and a larval source. So it's a good one to try to grow, but the growing conditions would be challenging. Grow in a sunny area again, well-drained soils, probably slightly acidic, but the drainage may have been an issue. I'm not sure. We probably have to see, a picture and get more information, but that's just kind of a hunch I have. But good luck for people trying to, grow some of our natives like Ceananthus, and hopefully it'll work out for her in the future.
Right, and Melissa also had a question about another plant. She says, as fall is nearing, I don't know how to care for my plumeria. Do I cut them back or just leave them be? I don't remember there being leaves there in the early spring. So the short answer is there's no need to cut them back. However, they do benefit from pruning. After flowering, the flower stalks turn brown and flop over, and the initial leaves may also begin to look tattered. So you want to remove the entire flower stalk and the older leaves. This will encourage the plant to rejuvenate and it'll look fresh again. More de-leafing may be necessary, especially if the summer weather is particularly hot or dry. And foliage that looks poor in midsummer heat can be cut back to the ground, and fresh foliage will produce for the cooler days of summer and fall. In early spring, you'll want to remove any winter damaged leaves, but rather than cutting it back, just carefully pull them out so you can preserve the emerging flowers. One thing that Steve noticed in your photos is it looked like there might be some rotting occurring. So these plants are susceptible to root rot, especially we've had wet weather this year, and if we're not in well-draining soils, that can certainly affect that. So be sure to prune any dead or diseased leaves and evaluate each plant, removing any that appear to be dying or diseased. Okay. And also, we have a question in reference to crepe myrtle trees. So I apologize, I don't have the name of the person who submitted this. I'll get that in just a moment. But he says, I moved here from Houston, Texas. Many city streets there were adorned with crepe myrtle trees. I have 2 here at my home and would like to prune them the way they did in Texas. The branches are cut down, and over the years they form knots at the cut section, so in the spring the new shoots come out in a spray-like formation. I have never seen them trim like that here and wondered why, and when is the correct time of the year to prune them? And I think, Steve, that's a question for you.
Okay. All right. So crepe myrtles, it's interesting how people prune them, and sometimes people prune them in a manner that may not look attractive, particularly in the winter months during the dormant season. So what people do is sometimes, because crepe myrtles generally grow fairly fast, and sometimes they get bigger than we liked, and we want to try to keep them all the same height. So people will prune them back, say 3 feet. The plant will grow out again 3 feet, and they'll prune it back annually. Essentially, it's like polarity, and that's a pruning technique that's developed over in Europe, where people would prune back a plant to a certain point each year, annual pruning, removing essentially the suckers or the shoots that come out, and they would harvest these shoots. So the reason people do that is that way you can keep the plant at the same height, but you create this knob during the winter. So if you're trying to keep your crepe myrtle to a height that you like, there's another way you can do that, and it involves a little bit more selectivity in the branches that you remove. So you see the branches growing up. One branch will go real tall, and you have one that's a little slower growing. You would prune out the one that's growing faster, and so you would prune to a lateral. That takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of finesse. It gives maybe a look that maybe not quite as maybe uniform, but a lot of people like pruning their crepe myrtles that way. But the other way, sometimes we'll prune it back to a knob. Sometimes people object to that. They call it crepe myrtle. During the growing season, you really don't notice it, but you notice it during the dormant season that essentially it's almost like you came straight across with like a saw or a chainsaw and you cut back to a specific point. If you do have that, you can remove those knobs, cut a little bit lower. Eventually, with some time, you can kind of correct it. But what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of growth from that place where you cut it. All the food energy from the plant, from down in the root system, the trunk, the major branches, is going to grow up to these tips, and you're getting a lot of growth. Sometimes almost so much growth that during the growing seasons like this, where we get a lot of rain, the shoots may get 3, 4, 5 feet long in the wind, and they break and they snap off. So sometimes what you may have to do is go through part of the growing season. You cut them back and thin them out, try to even it out. Because sometimes that shoot that goes up 2, 3, 4 feet long will have a very heavy flower at the end, and it will sag to the ground or snap off. So it's a little bit of management. So you're looking at your plant and how vigorous it is. Some of the more vigorous plants are going to command more attention with your pruning and heading back and thinning. The other, plants are not as vigorous, less pruning. So the way to kind of gotten around this is it's easier said than done, is you find a selection of crepe myrtle that you like, that's to the size that you like, and that hopefully you have to minimize the amount of pruning that you would have to do. The crepe myrtles come in all different sizes. There's some myrtleettes that get to 18 to 24 inches that we sell in some of the garden centers around here. And some will get 20 to 30 feet tall, even more. But trying to select the appropriate size cultivar for you is a good start. And crepe myrtles love the full sun. Some produce some seeds, and have some seedlings, maybe a little invasive. Most aren't too problematic. But there's probably a crepe myrtle out there for the size and has the flower color that you like and the bark characteristics. So it just takes a little bit of shopping and looking around.
All right. And I believe that was actually submitted by Melissa in Potomac, who also submitted this next question. She said, my lawn is in pretty bad shape from the hot summer and many rains. There are areas that are shady where it's the most damaged. Can I use peat moss on those parts of my lawn, and how do I do that? Or excuse me, can I plant moss on those parts of the lawn, and how do I do that?
Okay, so I think am I right? At least they're looking to control the moss in their lawn. So it's in. But
I think she wants to use to plant moss in those shady areas because they're in bad shape. So yeah, she's asking if she can plant moss there, and if so, how do I do that?
Yeah. So yeah, I just want to kind of clarify that, because it's interesting, because some people in this case, they want to promote moss. Other people want to get rid of moss. So so let's take a look at moss, what moss likes. So this is what moss likes to grow. You have it growing in your lawn. There's a number of characteristics it likes. It doesn't have to have all of these characteristics or things in your landscape to work, but it generally likes shade. It likes soils that are heavier, and we have a lot of that here in Montgomery County, some heavier, denser kind of clay-like soils. Moist, shade, acidic soils, and compacted. So if you have that, you probably have a good chance of getting moss growth. Some people would try to create more moss or have a moss garden. I had a few friends, or a friend that had essentially very proud of it. That's all they had. They didn't have any grass. They had a moss garden. It's a different kind of way to grow. Maybe for this person, it was their front lawn. It was pretty big in an urban area, and they had it. But for most of us, it's probably going to be sections of the yard. And they say, well, it's just too shady for the turf grass to grow there. I'm going to go a different direction. I'm going to grow with moss. And that makes a lot of sense. Turfgrass really needs sun. Sunnier it is, the better off it is. In areas where it's really shady, or if you can't increase the amount of light, you may want to look at different options, and maybe moss is one for you. You can buy actually moss online from places that have grown it in a manner that's ecologically sound. They haven't gone out and collected and things like that. And that's something I want to discourage people from doing. Sometimes they'll go to other places, maybe or more rural areas and parks and places, and they'll collect pieces of moss. There's ways where you can create, take your moss and culture it. Put it in buttermilk, put it in a blender. There's recipes for that, so you can spray it on or paste it on, trying to get the moss. But that's the type of kind of area it likes. Peat moss or some substrate like that that's more conducive to holding moisture. It's probably beneficial. I'm not too big on peat moss because it is a limited resource, and we use a lot of that already in the growing plants in the greenhouses and things like that. So I would probably use some type of maybe other organic matter acting as what's called like a substrate other than peat moss. And there's a wide variety of compost products, leaf mold and things out there you can find probably at your local garden center, or maybe screen it from your compost pile. And it might, you just go through your compost pile, have a screen, kind of sift through it, and you can probably get some, good compost organic matter that way. So one of the things you have to be careful about moss is that one of its big enemies are leaves. So as the leaves come off our trees, that's going to shade the moss. So you got to get the leaves off the moss, but you got to do it in a way where you can't use a rake. Use a rake, scrape up your moss. So you got to use a leaf blower, but you got to be gentle with it. You can't use one of these high-powered leaf blowers. Otherwise, your moss flips up like a toupee and it flops around, and you don't want that. So you can do it. And I think it's cool that people try to cultivate, promote moss in there, and maybe some of these other things that are like moss. And probably those conditions there are also going to be conducive to some other plants a lot of people like. A lot of our woodland perennials and ferns would probably like to be grown in an area around where there's areas of moss. But again, it's going to need some shade. It's going to need soil that retains moisture. It should be acidic. Good luck to somebody trying that. I think it's kind of cool to try to get, garden and, different ways and different techniques. And having a moss garden or part of your yard is moss garden, I think is kind of creative and cool.
Awesome. Well, that was our last question. I don't know if we've received any questions from our viewers.
No, nothing today. I think everyone's out in the garden working on a beautiful day. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Bev. What I was going to do is I was going to take a moment here and mention that the Montgomery County Master Gardeners have an annual training program each year. We had one this past year back in January and February. We usually hold it in the winter. We will have another annual training program the same time next year in 2021, but it's going to be all online. And if you're thinking about wanting to become a master gardener and become a volunteer with us, please send us an email or drop us a line. I think during the program, our contact information will be there. And if you do, we'll get back to you on that. The training program is probably going to be a similar format as we had before, but it's all online. It's going to be during the day. That's going to be about probably 30 to 40 hours of training. And if you're interested, please let us know. So thank you for joining us today here in the garden. Our next program will be on October 6th at noon. I hope you can make it then. And if you have any questions, remember, please put them in the comments section, and we'll try to get back to you soon. Thank you very much for joining us.